Hey, pediatric psychologist Dr. Mark Bowers here. Excited to be joining you for another round of question and answer with the psychologist. Got a great list of questions here today, so let's just jump right in. My child needs therapy, but I don't know what kind. I know a lot of therapies for pathological demand avoidance children are harmful, but my child needs to learn coping skills somehow. And yes, if you're going to enter into a traditional therapy, not that it's necessarily harmful, but therapy comes with demands. A lot of times to make significant progress, the therapist wants the individual to practice things when they're not in session. And so that may be perceived as a demand if a homework assignment is sent home, etc. But to early on at least engage a child with PDA, sometimes we have to go to an even more extreme that we don't even try to engage the child. Instead, we work with a therapist who's skilled in PDA and help the parent side of things. So we do parent consultation, which effectively then we train and teach the parent how to respond in various difficult, challenging situations from a home standpoint. As that starts to kind of make progress in the home, then we can start thinking about, okay, maybe we start introducing some, child-based therapy. And if the parent consultation has been, say, on a video conference, one little trick that I like to use is to allow, as time goes on, depending on how many sessions I'm doing with a set of parents or just a parent, we will keep the door open maybe and let the child know that the parent is having a session to sort of let their natural curiosity kind of come to life. And then maybe the child comes into the room and they get to see me and hear me a little bit, and they get to get kind of familiar with me on their own terms. Then that way, if I'm going to begin doing some work with them, then they kind of have a sense of who I am and that I've been helping mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or whomever else is invested in this child's life, and we kind of go from there. But if I'm not involved, then other ways, if you need some direct intervention, therapies to look at are things like acceptance and commitment therapy. ACT has been shown to work really well with children who have pathological demand avoidance. And a lot of that is there's a lot of great things in that therapeutic modality that have to do with tolerating uncertainty. And we know that many individuals, actually most individuals with PDA, really struggle and can't tolerate uncertainty, and ACT is a really powerful intervention for that. A lot of times the behavioral therapies like ABA and cognitive behavior therapy, there's nothing necessarily wrong with those therapies per se, but they come with a lot of demands, and the reason for that is that they are probably two of the most effective interventions available. And they try to then generalize the skills that you're learning in a clinic or in a therapy office into the real world, and that comes with obviously homework assignments, generalization strategies, and demands. Other great ways to interact with and do intervention with individuals with PDA are things like music therapy, art therapy, improvisational therapy, or just improv in general, dramatic types of therapy where you can play out drama roles. Role play is very powerful, and any sort of play therapy. Again, though, the clinician's going to need to be skilled and be very passive initially to work to develop rapport. And hopefully if that rapport gets locked in, then over time, as that child, that individual begins to feel more comfortable with the clinician, then that clinician can begin to sort of ramp up the so-called demands, if you will. So hopefully that helps. I would look into either parent consultation and hope that some of those results begin to sort of trickle down into the family system and onto the child. But also if you want some direct intervention, I listed and named all those therapies that you can look into. Okay, next question is, what's the best thing to do when kids are dysregulated or our child gets dysregulated? I think the quickest answer to that is just to be present. Don't necessarily narrate what they're doing, because sometimes that causes to increase a behavior. If you also tell them to stop doing certain things, that can also cause them, depending on their mood, to increase their behavior. I like to meet kids where they're at. So depending on the dysregulation, and I don't have more information than just what do I do when my child's dysregulated, if it's disruptive or destructive, ideally we would substitute out that behavior with something else meaningful, something else that also kind of served a similar purpose, which a lot of times it's just some sort of sensory interaction that the child is going for. Other times the child has sort of been in a pressure cooker situation where they've been basically bottling up stress and tension for the majority of the day, and oftentimes when kids come home, that's when they may look the most dysregulated. And sometimes that can be something as straightforward as a stim, where they want to pace or flap or rock or play with a special toy and visually stim on that for a while. And I wouldn't necessarily call that dysregulation. I would say that that's a child who's really trying to cope, a child who's trying to decompress and to calm themselves. But another issue is that a lot of kids become dysregulated because they don't know how to self-soothe. And so if you have a child who is consistently showing patterns of dysregulation around the home, we're going to want to talk at some point to an occupational therapist who can help us to devise a sensory diet so that we can figure out what this child's sensory needs are, what their sensory profile is, and meet them where they're at. And so accordingly, if we know they need heavy pressure, instead of letting them dysregulate all over the couch in the living room every time when people are in there trying to do other things, we have to designate a spot and give them actual exercises or activities that they enjoy, but that they can do in a manner that's safe and without interruption and without consequence. So those are some of the best things we can do. I would strongly encourage that you maybe consult with an occupational therapist if you haven't already, and look into sensory diets or what they call heavy work diets. Those can all be really good things. And ultimately, the bigger picture is teaching all kids, and I see this in younger generations of kids a lot lately, is all kids need help learning how to self-soothe and to self-entertain. And I think a lot of it has to do with the tablet generation that we see coming up post-COVID. A lot of kids are not spending nearly as much time as they need to in imaginative, creative, toy play, interactive play. They're instead playing games on a machine. And so we see a lot of dysregulation coming out as a result of that. Children who can sit down and work through themes with actual play and play partners really show a lot better ability to regulate themselves at the first entrance into school than what we're seeing a lot of kids enter into. As a highly dysregulated child coming into a kindergarten or a preschool classroom is probably a child who spent more time on a screen than they should have. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as well. How can we teach skills like dealing with big emotions or learning to be a little less rigid? Is that even possible? Well, sure it is, but a lot of it is figuring out how that child operates and what's going to motivate or incentivize them the most. Gamification is a very powerful strategy that can be used here to try to make things into games. But if we're talking about a lot of recurrent displays of big emotion, we definitely want to then back up a little bit and figure out, does this child need help with coping, with self-soothing, and with self-entertaining? Again, similar to the last question, but a lot of kids are showing that they don't know how to do this on their own, and many kids depend now on an adult, typically a parent, to do that. We see it coming up in sleeping arrangements and in other times when the child won't go to any other caregiver but one, and then once they have to separate from that caregiver to go elsewhere, say like to a school building, they have a real hard time being able to do that. And that's one of the challenges that sort of comes with being readily available for the child at all times. And again, I understand why parents get into the situation. The child begins to escalate, the parent shows up, and it sort of throws water onto the flame. That's a really good thing. But it only works when that parent is available, and so that becomes more of a challenge. Other things that we can do, we can make things into games, we can make it more playful when we're trying to make learning a little less rigid, when dealing with big emotions. Any help with self-soothing and coping is going to be useful, but even social skills groups can also be very, very beneficial. Another question is, how do you manage kids who are autistic, so they need warning to complete a task in X minutes, but who are also ADHD and forget you ever asked them to do the task when X minutes have gone by. Even with a timer, they just go, don't know what that's for, and then turn it off. Well, what that question tells me is that we haven't really coached and worked with and sort of worked on the task. And oftentimes when we're talking about somebody who's neurodivergent and has that sort of ADHD profile, we need to model a lot for them. We need to do things for them. Then we need to do things with them. Then we need to do things, have them do things on their own while we back off and we supervise, and we become more of a consultant in that role. And so if your child is sort of tuning the timer out, then we would know enough about this profile to also know that they're driven by some of their internal states, and that timer is not a shiny enough, important enough object for them to really tune into it and or care about it. And so until we've practiced and rehearsed using the timer, we may need to anchor the child to us. We may need to be that body double. If you've watched any of my social media videos, and there's a lot that even cover some of these questions that we're going over today. And if you haven't already, go over to drmarkbowers.org and subscribe to any of our social media channels, because we cover a wide variety of these different topics throughout the week as well, with a lot of really good strategies about how to use timers effectively, how to engage children, how to deal with big emotions, decrease rigidity, all things neurodivergent. And so what's happening here is this child hears the timer start, but then they don't really connect and engage with it. One of the things that we often recommend too is using a timer for starting the task and then having one for stopping the task. So you're actually running 2 timers at a time. Also making things visual with timers, having a sand glass, one of those sand timers, can make a big difference. Digital display, like a time timer where the red disappears over time. Or music. I find that music works really well for a lot of kids, where they're told they have to work for their playlist of 3 songs and then they can take a break, or they should be able to finish the task by the time the 3rd song is over, so that they can sort of have some way of measuring that time. Because oftentimes individuals who are neurodivergent, they're time blind. They lose track of time, and we give them a timer with the idea that, okay, we're going to sort of help them to get rid of that time blindness by putting this device right in front of them. But until they can see that it serves a purpose, then, what's it for? So using it for starting something, if you want to train that with a really oppositional child, you want to use start timers initially to start doing fun things, so that they just get used to, okay, let's set a timer, and when the timer goes off in the next 2 minutes from now, we're going to go into the kitchen and get a dessert. We're going to go outside and play your favorite game. We're going to talk about your favorite subject for 10 minutes or whatever it may be. So we start getting into the habit of then starting the task, which is something enjoyable initially, and then we can set the stop timer. So if we're going to indulge the child in a topic of their preferred interest, then we might set it for 5 or 10 minutes and let them know when that time is up, we need to stop the discussion and move on to something else. And then gamifying things obviously can be very, very powerful and helpful as well. So making anything into a game is always a great way to start. All right. So those are the questions for today. I hope you will follow this space and come back and visit us. We are on the path to doing these every week, and we're going to start doing some of these actually live here in a little bit as well. In the meantime, though, keep submitting your questions. They're excellent. They cover a wide variety of different, meaningful, appropriate topics for individuals. We're getting some really great feedback from folks about getting their questions answered. And yeah, just reach out, drop us a line. We appreciate you stopping by. I'm Dr. Mark Bowers, pediatric psychologist. Thanks for watching.